The new Madrid Anomaly, the day the Earth reset. The reverse flow and the liquid engine. The impossible physics of 1811. Imagine waking up in the dead of night to a sound so loud, so guttural, that you think the sky itself is tearing open. It's the 16th of December, 1811. You are in the heart of the American frontier, a place called New Madrid. The ground beneath your feet isn't just shaking, it's liquefying. But then, the impossible happens. You look out at the mighty Mississippi River, the lifeblood of the continent, and your brain refuses to process what you see. The water isn't flowing toward the Gulf of Mexico. It is surging backward, upstream. A wall of water, mud, and debris is fighting gravity, defying every law of hydrology you've ever known. For decades, history books have called this a natural disaster. They tell us it was a rare mid-continental earthquake. But there's a problem with that story, a big one. New Madrid sits in the middle of a tectonic plate, thousands of miles from the nearest fault line. To trigger an earthquake this powerful one that made church bells ring in Boston and tilted the very axis of the river, you don't just need a shift in the dirt, you need a massive discharge of energy. What if I told you the Mississippi River isn't just a river? What if, in 1811, it was the primary cooling system for a subterranean power grid that had been running for thousands of years? And what if the earthquake wasn't a natural event, but a catastrophic meltdown of an Antiquitech power node? Beyond magnitude, the anomalies. When a normal earthquake happens, the ground moves, buildings fall, and it's over. But New Madrid was different. The witness accounts from 1811 to 1812 read like a science fiction horror novel. First, there were the earthquake lights. Massive pillars of glowing, multicolored light shot out of the ground and into the atmosphere. This wasn't lightning. These were plasma discharges. In the world of Antiquitech, we know that the Earth's crust is a massive capacitor. When the internal power grid of the old world failed, the built-up electromagnetic energy had nowhere to go but up. Then there was the coal rain. Witnesses reported that the ground literally vomited up huge quantities of what looked like pitch-black coal and tar-like substances. Standard geology calls this sand blows. But if you look closer, these substances weren't just organic matter. They were the burnt-out remnants of a carbon-based conduction system. Imagine a massive CPU under the state of Missouri. When that CPU overheats and explodes, what does it leave behind? Silicon, carbon, and soot. New Madrid didn't just shake, it suffered a short circuit. The Mississippi cooling loop. To understand why the river flowed backward, you have to look at the Mississippi River through the lens of a mechanical engineer. Every high-powered energy system needs a cooling mechanism. In modern tech, we use fans, or liquid cooling. In the Antiquitech world of the 19th century, a world of star forts and ether energy, the great rivers were the cooling pipes. The Mississippi was designed to draw heat away from the massive crystal nodes buried deep within the 33rd parallel. When the New Madrid node suffered a catastrophic failure, perhaps due to the massive solar flares of that era or a deliberate sabotage during the War of 1812, the pressure buildup was so intense that it created a hydraulic shock. The reverse flow wasn't just water being pushed by a landslide. It was the result of a massive vacuum and subsequent pressure release from the underground chambers. It was a backflush of the cooling system. This is why the riverbed rose in some places and collapsed in others. The plumbing of the continent had just exploded. The Tecumseh data, prediction or protocol. Now, let's add a layer of human intelligence to this. While the American settlers were terrified, the Native American tribes, specifically the Shawnee under the leader Tecumseh, seemed to know exactly what was coming. History calls it a prophecy. Tecumseh's brother, known as the Prophet, told the tribes that on a specific day, the Great Spirit would stamp his foot and the earth would shake. He used this prediction to unite the tribes against the expansionist U.S. government. But what if this wasn't magic? What if Tecumseh and his people were the last guardians of the Antiquitech Operations Manual? The tribes of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys lived among the mounds, which we now realize were ancient energy structures. They knew the rhythms of the Earth's grid. They saw the power node at New Madrid destabilizing. They didn't predict a miracle. They read the system logs. Tecumseh knew the reset was imminent because he saw the signs of a failing power grid that his ancestors had lived alongside for millennia. He was trying to mobilize his people before the grid went dark and the new order took over. The 33rd parallel. The power line. If you look at a map of the world, something strange happens around the 33rd parallel north. This line cuts through New Madrid. It cuts through the Grand Canyon. It cuts through the ancient sites of Mesopotamia and Egypt. In the world of the old grid, the 33rd parallel was the main power line. It is a line of high telluric currents, natural electricity flowing through the earth. New Madrid was a strategic junction on this line. In 1811, this line was hot. The earthquake wasn't localized. It was a surge that traveled along the entire line. This is why church bells rang in Boston and why people in Canada felt the tremors. It was an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, that traveled through the bedrock. The U.S. government, even in its infancy, knew this. They knew that whoever controlled the New Madrid junction controlled the energy of the continent. And they were about to use a war to cover up the greatest technological reset in human history. The war for the grid and the scorched. History tells us that while the ground in New Madrid was still shaking, the United States was plunging into the War of 1812 against the British Empire. We are told this war was about maritime rights and trade restrictions. But look at the timeline. The Great Shaking began in December 1811, and the war was declared in June 1812. In the world of the truth seekers, we don't believe in coincidences this large. The War of 1812 wasn't a political dispute, it was a cleanup operation. The New Madrid meltdown had destabilized the entire atmospheric energy grid of North America. The star forts, those geometric masterpieces found along every coast and river, were malfunctioning. They were no longer silent power collectors. They were becoming dangerous, uncontrolled emitters of frequency. The elite of both the British and the Americans knew that the old world infrastructure was failing. They needed a war to justify the massive movement of troops and the systematic destruction of the evidence. They needed a scorched earth policy to burn the past and make way for the new, metered, carbon-based economy. The burning of the records, why DC had to burn. August 1814. The British march into Washington, D.C. They don't just occupy the city, they go straight for the Library of Congress and the White House. Why? History books claim it was a retaliation for the burning of York in Canada. But think like a forensic investigator. If you want to reset a civilization, you don't just kill the people, you kill their memory. The Library of Congress held the original maps of the Lugdiaku, maps that showed the massive Tartarian cities of the West, the subterranean tunnels of the Mississippi Valley, and the technical blueprints of the Antiquitech nodes. They burned the records to ensure that future generations, people like you and me, would believe that the Americas were just a wilderness filled with primitive people. They replaced the ancient architectural history with a fabricated story of pioneers and log cabins. The fire in D.C. was a data wipe. By the time the smoke cleared, the blueprints of the atmospheric grid were gone, replaced by the new maps of the United States Corporation. The miracle tornado, weather manipulation. As the British were burning Washington, D.C., something miraculous happened. A freak tornado, one of the most violent in history, descended directly on the city. It put out the fires, blew the British cannons off their mounts, and forced the invaders to retreat in terror. History calls it divine intervention. But in the context of the New Madrid meltdown, we have to ask, was this a weather weapon? The New Madrid event had ripped a hole in the ionosphere. The atmosphere was highly charged with electromagnetic energy. It is well known in Antiquitech research that star forts and spires could influence local weather patterns by modulating frequency. Was the 1814 tornado a result of a surviving frequency resonator being activated? Or was it a backlash from the Earth itself, trying to stabilize the massive energy surge from the burnt-out New Madrid node? The miracle of Washington wasn't an act of God. It was an act of high-frequency physics. Star forts, the circuit boards of war. Look at Fort McHenry, the place where the Star-Spangled Banner was written during the War of 1812. Look at its shape from above. It's a perfect five-pointed star. Mainstream history says this shape was for defensive angles against cannons. But if you look at a modern microwave antenna or a circuit board, you see the same geometry. During the War of 1812, these forts were the hubs of the atmospheric grid. The British weren't just bombarding Fort McHenry with bombs bursting in air. They were trying to detune it. They were using specialized frequencies to disrupt the fort's ability to act as a resonance tower. The rocket's red glare wasn't just gunpowder. It was the visualization of a high-energy atmospheric battle. Washington and the elite knew that if they lost the star forts, they lost the ability to harvest free energy from the ether. The war was about who would hold the keys to the physical grid of the new world. The transition to carbon, killing the ether. By the time the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1814, the reset was nearly complete. The new Madrid meltdown had provided the perfect excuse to tell the public that the old world was dangerous and unstable. This is the moment the monopoly of energy began. They replaced the clean, silent, atmospheric electricity of the Tartarian era with dirty, expensive, and metered energy. They moved to coal. They moved to oil. They moved to centralized grids. They took the free energy that everyone could harvest from the air using simple copper spires, and they locked it behind a paywall. The new Madrid earthquake was the funeral of the ether age. They used the chaos of the reverse flow and the fires of the war to bury the massive Antiquitech machinery under millions of tons of mud and silt. This is the origin of the mudflood, not just a natural event, but a deliberate scrubbing of the landscape to hide the true technological height of the 1800s. The 1816 reset, the frozen evidence. The final phase of the New Madrid reset came in 1816, the year without a summer. Across the United States, the ground froze in July. Crops failed. People starved. Millions were forced to migrate westward. Mainstream science blames a volcano in Indonesia, Mount Tambora. But we have to look at the energy balance. The atmospheric grid had been shattered at New Madrid. The protective layer of energy that regulated the climate was gone. The 1816 freeze was the cold boot of the system. It forced the population to abandon the old Tartarian urban centers and move into the newly designated settlements where the government could control the food, the water, and the information. They used the weather as a shepherd to drive the human cattle into the new industrial paradigm. The old world was officially dead, buried under ice and mud. The Smithsonian shredder and the silent grid. The Smithsonian vacuum, erasing the evidence. If the New Madrid event was just a standard earthquake, why did the U.S. government rush to establish preservation institutions immediately afterward? Look at the Smithsonian Institution. Founded in 1846 with money from a British man who never even set foot in America, the Smithsonian isn't just a museum, it is a historical vacuum. Before 1811, the Mississippi Valley was home to thousands of ancient mounds and earthwork pyramids with incredible electromagnetic properties. Early settlers' reports described finding sophisticated copper devices, stone tablets engraved with what looked like circuit board patterns, and even the skeletons of giants inside these structures. When the New Madrid meltdown occurred, it didn't just shake the ground, it exposed the subterranean machine rooms beneath these mounds. The Smithsonian was dispatched to collect and classify these finds. The result? Every single artifact that proved the existence of a high-tech civilization in America vanished into classified vaults. They called it archaeology, but we know it was crime scene cleanup. They needed to erase the evidence of a wireless ether power grid before they could sell us on expensive, metered copper wiring. Reelfoot Lake, the drowned node. One of the strangest relics of the 1812 disaster is Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee. It was created in a single night when the ground collapsed and the Mississippi River flowed backward to fill it. Textbooks call it a geological sinkhole, but look at it from above. Reelfoot Lake sits at a strategic junction on the Earth's ley lines. There are more than just fossilized trees at the bottom of Reelfoot Lake. Independent divers and researchers have reported geometric stone structures, large metallic masses buried in the silt, and intense electromagnetic anomalies that fry modern sensors. Reelfoot Lake wasn't a geological accident. It was a controlled flooding. In modern engineering, when a nuclear reactor suffers a meltdown, the best way to contain the energy leak is to flood it with water. Reelfoot Lake is the massive cap used to cool and seal the exploded Antiquitech power node. The river flowed backward not because of terrain changes, it was an emergency hydraulic flush of the Earth's energy management system. The 33rd parallel today, still active. Why is the 33rd parallel so important? Look at what sits on this line. New Madrid, Roswell, White Sands, site of the first nuclear test, and massive NSA data centers. The ancient ether power grid never truly disappeared. It was simply occupied and rebranded. What we call earthquakes in the New Madrid zone today often happen without clear geological warnings. Why? Because the subterranean grid beneath is still trying to self-calibrate. Image comparing ancient star fort locations with modern power substations and data centers. The elite know that New Madrid is the backbone of the North American electromagnetic grid. This is why FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has such incredibly detailed disaster scenarios for the New Madrid region, drills larger in scope than even a nuclear war. They aren't afraid of the ground shaking. They are afraid of a legacy energy spike from the past that could fry our current digital power grid. They are sitting on an Antiquitech energy bomb they can't fully control, only cover up with complex scientific jargon. The carbon trap. Why we pay for power. Ask yourself a simple question. If, before 1812, humans could harvest free electricity from the air via star forts and spires, why do we have to pay for every single kilowatt now? The New Madrid disaster was the ultimate business opportunity. By turning a technical failure into a horrific natural disaster, the emerging financial titans, like the early Rothschild and Rockefeller, families convinced the world that ether energy was unstable and dangerous. They forced us into the carbon trap. They dug coal. They pumped oil. They built smoke-belching factories. They turned energy from a natural right into a metered commodity. The War of 1812 and the New Madrid disaster were two sides of the same coin. One destroyed the old infrastructure. The other established the new control system. When the Mississippi River flowed backward, it marked the moment humanity began to regress into the era of fossil fuel slavery. We were reset from a brilliant civilization to an industrial workforce. The final wake-up call, breaking the reset. So, what do? The first step to breaking the control is to see the lie. The next time you walk past an old building with a copper dome or look at a star fort that's called a historic ruin, don't look at it with the eyes of a tourist. Look at it with the eyes of an OSINT engineer. Those are the surviving components of a massive computer. Those buried windows weren't an eccentric design. They are the scars of a mudflood that swept through to bury the truth. The New Madrid event of 1812 is a reminder that the Earth has its own operating system, and the people trying to manage us are just clumsy hackers. They can burn the books, they can flood the lakes, and they can use the Smithsonian to hide the artifacts, but they cannot change the fact that free energy is real. The atmosphere around you is still pulsing with electrical potential. The rivers are still flowing over eternal energy veins. The reset only works if we stay asleep in the textbooks written by the victors. It's time we reboot our own minds. The truth isn't under the ground. It's right in front of our eyes, waiting for us to be brave enough to see it.